You think medieval medicine was primitive and backward? Tomorrow, you could wake up in a world where doctors prescribe intercourse with strangers as treatment for hysteria, where physicians drill holes in skulls to release evil spirits, and where the cure for pregnancy complications involves drinking powdered unicorn horn mixed with mercury. Medieval women didn't just face the dangers of childbirth and disease, they faced a medical establishment that viewed their bodies as fundamentally flawed, their minds as inherently unstable, and their suffering as divinely ordained punishment that required increasingly brutal correction. What I'm about to reveal isn't taught in any medical history course. It's the raw, unfiltered truth about how medieval physicians turned healing into systematic torture, specifically targeting women with procedures so horrifying they make modern medical malpractice look like gentle massage therapy. We're diving into documented medical practices from 800 to 1500 CE that would violate every principle of modern medicine and human decency. But here's what makes this historical nightmare truly disturbing. These weren't the desperate experiments of mad doctors working in secret. These were accepted medical procedures taught in universities, practiced in monasteries, and endorsed by the church. The physicians performing these procedures genuinely believed they were healing their patients, even as they destroyed their bodies and minds with methods that seemed designed by demons rather than doctors. I've spent months researching primary medical texts from medieval monasteries, university manuscripts that survived the centuries, and court records documenting what happened when these treatments went wrong. What I discovered will fundamentally change how you view both medieval society and the evolution of women's healthcare. The systematic brutality wasn't accidental, it was methodical, documented, and considered the height of medical sophistication. We're about to journey through 4 levels of medieval medical horror, specifically targeting women. First, the wandering womb theory that blamed every female ailment on a uterus that supposedly traveled around the body like a rebellious organ seeking satisfaction. Then, the bloodletting rituals where physicians drained women's life force to cure everything from melancholy to morning sickness. We'll expose the trepanation procedures where doctors drilled through skulls to release the evil spirits causing female hysteria. And finally, the fertility treatments that killed more women than they helped, using ingredients and methods that would qualify as attempted murder today. Each revelation will make you more grateful for modern medical ethics than you've ever been in your life. But understanding this history is crucial because echoes of these medieval attitudes toward women's bodies persist in medical practice today. The assumption that women's pain is psychological, that their symptoms are exaggerated, that their bodies are inherently problematic. These aren't new prejudices. They're medieval prejudices that have survived centuries of supposed medical progress. Let's start with the medical theory that made every medieval woman a walking time bomb of potential organ rebellion. Picture this scenario if you can. You're a 25-year-old woman in 1300 CE. You wake up with a headache, and by evening, a physician is explaining to your husband that your uterus has become detached and is wandering through your body, causing havoc wherever it settles. The cure? He must immediately arrange for you to have intimate relations with multiple men because your womb is seeking satisfaction and will only return to its proper position once it's been adequately appeased. This wasn't medieval folklore or peasant superstition. This was established medical doctrine taught at the University of Paris, practiced in monasteries across Europe, and written into official medical textbooks that physicians consulted for over 700 years. The wandering womb theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and enthusiastically adopted by medieval doctors, held that the female uterus was essentially a hungry animal living inside women's bodies, capable of independent movement and possessed of its own desires and appetites. According to this theory, documented in medical manuscripts that survive today, the uterus could travel throughout a woman's body, causing symptoms wherever it lodged. If it moved to the stomach, it caused nausea and loss of appetite. If it traveled to the heart, it created palpitations and chest pain. If it settled in the brain, it produced the condition physicians called hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for any behavior they deemed inappropriate in women. The medical logic was breathtakingly circular and completely insane. Women who were too emotional had wombs that had traveled to their hearts. Women who were too intellectual had wombs pressing on their brains. Women who were too sexual had wombs that were properly positioned, but overly active. Women who weren't sexual enough had wombs that were dormant and needed awakening. Every possible female behavior could be explained by womb position and activity. But here's where the theory became truly sinister. Medieval physicians believed they could manipulate womb position through external treatments that ranged from uncomfortable to potentially lethal. The prescribed cures reveal a medical establishment obsessed with controlling women's bodies through the most invasive means possible. For a womb that had supposedly traveled too high in the body, physicians prescribed fumigation treatments. Women would be positioned over smoking braziers filled with foul-smelling substances like burning sulfur, rotten fish, or human excrement. The theory was that the terrible odors would drive the womb back down to its proper position. The reality was that women were being systematically poisoned by toxic fumes, while physicians watched and took notes on their responses. The fumigation chambers were specially constructed torture devices disguised as medical equipment. Stone or wooden chairs with holes in the seats were positioned over fire pits. Women would be strapped into these chairs, naked from the waist down, while physicians controlled the intensity and duration of the toxic smoke exposure. The treatments could last hours, with women fainting from the fumes only to be revived and subjected to more fumigation. Medical records from monasteries describe women dying during these treatments, their deaths attributed to the severity of their womb displacement rather than the obvious poisoning from toxic fumes. One manuscript from the Abbey of St. Denis describes a young mother who died after 3 hours of sulfur fumigation, her death recorded as evidence that her womb had been too severely displaced for any earthly cure to help. For wombs that had supposedly traveled too low, physicians prescribed the opposite treatment. Sweet-smelling substances like roses, cinnamon, and honey would be applied to the woman's face and upper body to attract the womb upward. This sounds gentle compared to fumigation, but the application methods were invasive and degrading. Women would be forced to inhale concentrated floral essences until they experienced severe allergic reactions or breathing difficulties. The attraction treatments often involved inserting aromatic substances directly into various body openings, with physicians claiming they needed to create scent pathways to guide the wandering womb back to its proper position. The materials used included everything from expensive spices to animal secretions, applied without any understanding of infection, allergic reactions, or basic sanitation. But the most disturbing aspect of wandering womb theory was how it was used to justify systematic sexual assault disguised as medical treatment. Physicians regularly prescribed intimate relations as cure for womb displacement, but not necessarily with the woman's husband. The medical logic held that different types of male contact would affect the womb differently. So, physicians would sometimes prescribe intimate encounters with multiple partners, younger men, older men, or men of different social classes depending on the specific symptoms being treated. These prescriptions were written into official medical documents that survive in monastery libraries today. Physicians would provide detailed instructions about the frequency, duration, and type of intimate contact required for medical purposes. Women had no legal right to refuse these treatments, especially when prescribed by church-approved physicians. Husbands were legally obligated to ensure their wives received the prescribed medical care, even if it involved arranging intimate encounters with other men. The psychological impact of wandering womb theory on medieval women was catastrophic and generational. Every emotion, every physical symptom, every moment of discomfort could be attributed to organ displacement that required invasive correction. Women learned to suppress their natural responses to pain, illness, and emotional distress because expressing these feelings would trigger medical interventions that were often worse than the original problems. The theory created a perfect system of medical gaslighting that lasted for centuries. Women who complained about the treatments were told their resistance proved their wombs were severely displaced and required more aggressive intervention. Women who submitted quietly were praised for allowing proper medical care but continued to receive treatments because submission itself was seen as evidence of womb activity that needed monitoring. Medieval medical texts reveal the elaborate diagnostic procedures physicians used to determine womb position and movement. These examinations were invasive, degrading, and conducted without any concept of patient privacy or consent. Women would be subjected to internal examinations by multiple physicians who claimed they could feel the womb's position and movement through manual exploration. The diagnostic process often took hours and involved multiple physicians taking turns conducting examinations, while scribes recorded their findings. Women were positioned in various degrading poses while physicians debated the location and orientation of internal organs they couldn't actually see or properly understand. The examinations themselves often caused the symptoms they were supposedly diagnosing, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of medical intervention. The economic exploitation built into wandering womb theory was systematic and sophisticated. Wealthy families paid enormous fees for physicians to monitor their women's womb activity through regular examinations and treatments. Poor women received charity medical care from monasteries that used them as training subjects for student physicians. No woman, regardless of social class, could escape the medical establishment's obsession with controlling her internal organs. The treatments generated massive revenue for physicians, apothecaries, and monasteries. Fumigation treatments required expensive materials and specialized equipment. Attraction treatments used costly spices and aromatics. The prescribed intimate encounters often involved payments to male participants. The diagnostic examinations required multiple medical professionals. Women's bodies became profit centers for a medical establishment that had no incentive to question theories that generated so much income. But the wandering womb was just the beginning of medieval medicine's assault on women's bodies. The next level of medical horror involved literally draining the life from women through bloodletting procedures that were supposed to cure everything from sadness to morning sickness. Medieval physicians believed that women's blood was fundamentally different from men's blood and infinitely more dangerous. According to medical texts from the University of Bologna and the monastery schools of Chartres, female blood was considered inherently corrupt, prone to stagnation, and capable of poisoning the entire body, if not regularly purged through systematic bloodletting. This wasn't occasional medical bleeding. This was scheduled, ritualized blood extraction that turned women into human fountains. Drained monthly whether they were healthy or dying, the menstrual cycle became the foundation for the most elaborate bloodletting protocols in medical history. Physicians taught that women's monthly bleeding was insufficient to purge the corrupt humors that naturally accumulated in female bodies. They prescribed additional bloodletting sessions timed to what they called the lunar corruption cycle, where women would be bled at specific moon phases to prevent their blood from becoming too poisonous for their bodies to contain. Picture the medical calendar that governed medieval women's lives. First week after menstruation, mandatory bleeding to prevent new corruption from taking hold. Second week, prophylactic bleeding to maintain proper humor balance. Third week, preparatory bleeding to ready the body for the next menstrual cycle. Fourth week, corrective bleeding to address any symptoms that had appeared despite previous treatments. This meant that healthy women were being systematically bled 12 to 16 times per month, every month, for their entire reproductive lives. The bloodletting instruments used on women were specifically designed to maximize blood loss while prolonging the extraction process. Standard male bloodletting used simple lancets for quick, controlled bleeding. Female bloodletting employed specialized devices that created multiple bleeding points simultaneously and could be adjusted to increase or decrease flow rates based on the physician's assessment of corruption levels. The scarification wheels used on women were rotating devices with dozens of small blades that created intricate patterns of cuts across the arms, legs, and torso. Physicians would roll these wheels across women's skin while applying pressure, creating geometric patterns of bleeding wounds that would drain for hours. The more elaborate the pattern, the more prestigious the physician and the more expensive the treatment. Cupping procedures for women involved heated glass vessels that created suction to draw blood through the skin. But while male cupping used single cups applied for brief periods, Female cupping employed arrays of dozens of cups applied simultaneously across the entire body. Women would be covered in glass vessels, their skin pulled up into painful peaks as blood was drawn through thousands of tiny ruptures in the skin surface. The leech application protocols for women were particularly systematic and horrifying. Physicians maintained detailed charts showing optimal leech placement for different female ailments. Melancholy required leeches applied to the temples and behind the ears. Excessive emotion called for leeches on the chest near the heart. Morning sickness was treated with leeches applied to the abdomen and lower back. Difficult labor was addressed with leeches placed on the thighs and genitals, but the leech treatments went far beyond simple application. Physicians bred specialized leeches for use on women, believing that different types of leeches could extract different types of corrupt blood. Marsh leeches for thick black blood that caused depression. River leeches for thin, red blood that caused hysteria. Pond leeches for yellow blood that caused digestive problems. Women would have multiple species of leeches applied simultaneously, their bodies becoming feeding grounds for dozens of blood-sucking parasites. The bloodletting schedules were adjusted based on women's life stages in ways that guaranteed maximum extraction during periods when women were already physically vulnerable. Pregnant women received intensive bleeding to prevent their corrupt blood from contaminating the developing child. New mothers were bled immediately after delivery to prevent post-birth complications. Young girls beginning menstruation were bled to establish proper patterns of blood purification. Elderly women past menopause received the most aggressive bleeding of all, since their bodies were no longer naturally purging corrupt blood through monthly cycles. The pregnancy bloodletting protocols reveal medieval medicine at its most dangerous and illogical. Physicians taught that pregnant women's blood became increasingly corrupt as the pregnancy progressed, threatening both mother and child. The prescribed treatment was escalating bloodletting throughout pregnancy, with the most intensive bleeding scheduled for the final weeks before delivery, when women's bodies needed maximum strength for labor and survival. Medical manuscripts describe pregnant women being bled until they fainted, then revived and bled again. The theory was that corrupt blood would pool in the extremities, so multiple bleeding sessions were necessary to extract all the dangerous humors. Women would lose pints of blood during these sessions, leaving them weak, anemic, and vulnerable to infection, but physicians interpreted these symptoms as evidence that the treatments were working and more bleeding was needed. The post-delivery bloodletting was even more extreme. New mothers were considered to be in maximum danger from blood corruption, since childbirth was believed to stir up all the corrupt humors that had accumulated during pregnancy. Women would be bled within hours of giving birth, often while still bleeding naturally from delivery. The combination of natural blood loss and medical bleeding killed thousands of new mothers who might have survived childbirth itself. The diagnostic bloodletting created another layer of medical torture disguised as healthcare. Physicians claimed they could diagnose women's ailments by examining the color, consistency, and flow rate of extracted blood. This meant that women reporting any symptoms would be subjected to exploratory bleeding, where physicians would extract blood from multiple locations while observing its characteristics. The blood examination process was elaborate theater designed to justify extensive bleeding procedures. Physicians would collect blood in special vessels, hold it up to candlelight, swirl it around while muttering in Latin, and consult elaborate charts that supposedly correlated blood characteristics with specific ailments. The more exotic the blood appeared, the more extensive the follow-up bleeding treatments would be. Different blood colors meant different treatments, but all treatments involved more bleeding. Dark blood indicated melancholic corruption requiring extensive body-wide bloodletting. Bright red blood suggested sanguine excess needing immediate drainage. Pale blood pointed to phlegmatic imbalance demanding targeted bleeding from specific body regions. Yellow-tinged blood revealed choleric poisoning requiring emergency bloodletting until the color normalized. The seasonal bloodletting schedules imposed additional bleeding requirements based on medieval physicians' understanding of how corrupt female blood interacted with environmental factors. Spring bleeding to prevent the warming weather from overheating women's already corrupt blood. Summer bleeding to counteract the dangerous effects of heat on female humors. Fall bleeding to prepare women's bodies for the cold months when blood would thicken and become more toxic. Winter bleeding to prevent the corrupt blood from freezing inside women's bodies and causing death. The religious justification for female bloodletting created moral obligations that made refusal virtually impossible. Church-approved physicians taught that women's blood corruption was a consequence of Eve's sin, and that regular bloodletting was a form of penance that could reduce women's spiritual debt. Refusing medical bleeding wasn't just medically dangerous, it was spiritually rebellious and potentially heretical. Monastery infirmaries developed specialized bloodletting chapels where female patients would be bled while priests performed purification rituals. The blood extraction was combined with confession, prayer, and sometimes exorcism, creating a medical religious experience that was supposed to cleanse women's bodies and souls simultaneously. Women who died during these procedures were often declared martyrs, who had achieved spiritual purification through medical sacrifice. The economic structure surrounding female bloodletting created powerful incentives for physicians to prescribe excessive treatments. Bloodletting procedures generated revenue through multiple channels: the initial consultation and diagnosis fees, the cost of specialized bloodletting equipment, charges for leeches, which were expensive to breed and maintain, follow-up examination fees to monitor treatment effectiveness, additional bleeding sessions based on blood examination results. Wealthy women became repeat customers who required constant monitoring and frequent bleeding to maintain their health. Poor women received charity bloodletting from monasteries that used them as training subjects for apprentice physicians. The medical establishment had no economic incentive to question bloodletting theories that generated steady income from every woman in medieval society. The survival rates from aggressive female bloodletting were catastrophically low, but physicians interpreted deaths as evidence that women's blood corruption had been too severe for any earthly treatment to help. Women who died during bloodletting procedures were said to have been saved from worse fates, since their corrupt blood would have eventually poisoned them anyway. Families were told that the bloodletting had given their daughters, wives, and mothers a chance at purification that they wouldn't have had otherwise. But even bloodletting paled in comparison to the ultimate medieval medical procedure that literally opened women's skulls to release the evil spirits causing their inappropriate behavior. The trepanation procedures performed on medieval women represent the absolute peak of medical barbarism disguised as sophisticated treatment. When bloodletting and womb manipulation failed to cure what physicians diagnosed as female hysteria, they turned to the most extreme intervention in their arsenal. They would drill holes directly through women's skulls to release the evil spirits that were supposedly causing their rebellious thoughts, emotional outbursts, and inappropriate behavior. Trepanation wasn't some desperate last resort performed by desperate quacks in back alleys. This was cutting-edge medical technology taught at the most prestigious universities in Europe and practiced in the finest monastery hospitals. The procedure manuals that survive from institutions like the medical school at Salerno provide step-by-step instructions for skull drilling that read like technical guides for medieval brain surgery, complete with detailed diagrams showing optimal hole placement for different types of female spiritual possession. The diagnostic criteria for determining which women needed skull drilling reveal the true purpose of these procedures. It wasn't about treating genuine medical conditions. It was about punishing women whose behavior challenged medieval social expectations. Women who spoke too boldly were diagnosed with evil spirits affecting their speech centers. Women who refused arranged marriages had demons controlling their romantic impulses. Women who questioned religious doctrine suffered from devils manipulating their reasoning abilities. Women who showed too much intelligence were possessed by spirits that needed immediate exorcism through cranial drilling. The preparation rituals for female trepanation were elaborate ceremonies that combined medical procedure with religious theater. Women would be brought to specially consecrated operating chambers, where priests would perform preliminary exorcisms while physicians prepared their drilling equipment. The patient would be strapped to wooden tables carved with religious symbols and surrounded by candles, incense, and holy relics. The atmosphere was designed to convince everyone present that they were witnessing a battle between medical science and supernatural evil. The drilling instruments used on women were far more elaborate than those used for male patients. Standard male trepanation employed simple boring tools that created single holes for practical purposes, like relieving pressure from head injuries. Female trepanation used specialized drilling arrays that created multiple holes in precise geometric patterns across the skull. Physicians believed that different evil spirits required different sized openings for proper release, so women's skulls would be perforated with varying hole diameters arranged according to complex spiritual formulas. The crown trepan was the most sophisticated drilling device, featuring multiple rotating bits that could create elaborate patterns of skull perforations in a single procedure. Physicians would mark women's skulls with detailed templates showing where each hole should be drilled, creating geometric designs that supposedly corresponded to different types of spiritual contamination. The more complex the pattern, the more prestigious the physician, and the more expensive the procedure. The location selection for drill holes was based on medieval physicians' understanding of how evil spirits inhabited different areas of women's brains. The frontal skull region was drilled to release spirits controlling inappropriate speech and rebellious thoughts. The temporal areas were perforated to address spirits affecting emotional regulation and romantic desires. The crown of the skull received holes to eliminate spirits causing intellectual pride and religious questioning. Some women received dozens of holes across their entire skull surface. But here's what makes these procedures truly horrifying, beyond the obvious physical trauma. Medieval physicians had no understanding of brain anatomy, no concept of infection control, and no effective anesthesia. Women were conscious during skull drilling procedures that could last for hours. They would be physically restrained while physicians slowly bored through their skulls with hand-cranked drilling devices, all while being told that their screaming was actually the voices of demons being expelled from their heads. The sound of the drilling process was considered an important diagnostic tool. Physicians would listen carefully to the noise made by their drill bits as they penetrated different layers of skull bone, claiming they could identify the types of evil spirits present based on the acoustic patterns. High-pitched grinding sounds indicated one type of demonic possession. Low rumbling noises suggested different spiritual contamination. The drilling would continue until physicians heard what they interpreted as the proper sounds of spiritual release. The brain matter that often emerged from the drill holes was examined with the same ritualistic intensity as blood during bloodletting procedures. Physicians would study the color, consistency, and flow patterns of brain tissue, consulting elaborate charts that supposedly correlated different brain characteristics with specific types of evil spirit infestation. Dark brain matter indicated powerful demons requiring additional drilling. Pale tissue suggested weaker spirits that might be expelled with smaller holes. Any unusual coloration was interpreted as evidence of exotic spiritual possession, requiring experimental drilling techniques. The survival rates from female trepanation were even lower than those from aggressive bloodletting, but for different reasons. While bloodletting killed through blood loss and anemia, trepanation killed through immediate trauma, infection, and brain damage. Medical records from monastery hospitals show that fewer than half of women survived the drilling procedures themselves, and most of those who survived the initial operation died within days from brain swelling and infection. The post-operative care for female trepanation patients reveals medieval medicine at its most delusional and dangerous. Physicians believed that the drill holes needed to remain open for extended periods to allow continued spirit release, so they would insert various objects into the skull openings to prevent healing. Metal tubes, wooden plugs, and even precious stones were embedded in women's skulls to maintain the openings that physicians claimed were necessary for ongoing spiritual purification. The infection rates were catastrophic, but physicians interpreted the resulting brain abscesses and skull inflammation as evidence that more evil spirits were being expelled through the drill holes. Women who developed fevers and delirium after trepanation were said to be experiencing the final stages of demonic exorcism. Those who died were declared spiritually cleansed martyrs, who had achieved purification through medical sacrifice. The follow-up drilling procedures imposed on surviving women were even more extensive than the original operations. Physicians would monitor the drill holes for months, claiming they could observe ongoing spiritual activity through the skull openings. Any behavior that seemed inappropriate or rebellious was attributed to new evil spirit infestation requiring additional holes. Some women received dozens of trepanation procedures over years of treatment, their skulls becoming honeycomb patterns of medical drilling. The family dynamics surrounding female trepanation created impossible situations for medieval women. Husbands were legally obligated to authorize skull drilling procedures when physicians diagnosed their wives with evil spirit possession. Fathers had religious duties to ensure their daughters received proper spiritual medical care. Women had no legal right to refuse trepanation procedures, especially when prescribed by church-approved physicians who claimed the treatments were necessary for both physical health and spiritual salvation. The economic exploitation built into female trepanation was systematic and sophisticated. The procedures required expensive specialized equipment that only the most established physicians could afford. The drilling sessions often lasted entire days, generating massive fees for extended surgical time. The post-operative monitoring created ongoing revenue streams through regular examination and whole maintenance appointments. The repeat procedures prescribed for most surviving patients ensured that trepanation became a lifetime medical expense for families with affected women. The religious justification for skull drilling on women created moral obligations that made questioning the procedures virtually impossible. Church-approved physicians taught that women's evil spirit possession was a consequence of their inherent spiritual weakness and susceptibility to demonic influence. Trepanation was presented as a form of medical exorcism that could save women's souls while treating their bodies. Refusing skull drilling wasn't just medically negligent, it was spiritually irresponsible and potentially heretical. The training programs for trepanation specialists created a medical establishment with powerful professional incentives to diagnose evil spirit possession in women. Apprentice physicians learned skull drilling techniques by practicing on female patients in monastery hospitals. The more complex the trepanation patterns they could create, the more prestigious their medical reputations became. Master physicians competed to develop innovative drilling techniques and sophisticated diagnostic criteria for determining which women needed cranial intervention. The documentation requirements for female trepanation procedures created detailed medical records that survive today as evidence of systematic medical torture. Physicians were required to record the specific evil spirits they claimed to identify, the drilling patterns they used to address different types of possession, and the spiritual outcomes they observed during post-operative monitoring. These records read like inventories of medieval medical sadism disguised as scientific observation. But even the horror of skull drilling paled in comparison to the fertility treatments that were supposed to help women conceive and bear children, but instead created a medical holocaust that killed more women than it helped. The fertility medicine practiced on medieval women represents perhaps the most deadly combination of medical ignorance and systematic poisoning in human history. When women struggled to conceive or suffered pregnancy complications, physicians prescribed treatments that sound like recipes for chemical warfare rather than medical care. The ingredient lists for medieval fertility medicines read like inventories from a poisoner's laboratory, featuring toxic metals, radioactive minerals, and organic compounds so dangerous they would be classified as chemical weapons today. The foundation of medieval fertility treatment was the belief that women's reproductive organs required constant chemical intervention to function properly. Physicians taught that the female reproductive system was inherently defective and prone to corruption that could only be corrected through regular consumption of increasingly exotic and dangerous substances. The more expensive and difficult to obtain the ingredients, the more effective the treatment was believed to be. Mercury was the cornerstone of medieval fertility medicine, prescribed for everything from irregular menstruation to pregnancy complications. Physicians believed that mercury's liquid metal properties could restore proper flow and movement to women's reproductive organs. Women were given mercury in multiple forms: liquid mercury to drink, mercury vapor to inhale, and mercury compounds to insert directly into their bodies. The dosages prescribed were lethal by any modern standard, but medieval physicians interpreted the resulting poisoning symptoms as evidence that the treatments were working. The mercury preparation rituals were elaborate alchemical procedures that transformed basic poisoning into expensive medical theater. Physicians would heat mercury with various other toxic substances while reciting Latin incantations, creating mercury compounds that were even more dangerous than pure mercury itself. The resulting mixtures would be blessed by priests and administered to women during elaborate ceremonies that combined medical treatment with religious ritual. Lead compounds formed another major category of medieval fertility treatment, prescribed specifically for women who had suffered miscarriages or stillbirths. Physicians believed that lead's heavy, stable properties could anchor pregnancies and prevent future losses. Women were given lead acetate solutions to drink, lead oxide powders to consume, and lead foil insertions for internal application. The lead poisoning that resulted was interpreted as the metal working to stabilize their reproductive systems. The arsenic treatments prescribed for female fertility problems reveal medieval medicine's complete ignorance of basic toxicology. Physicians believed that arsenic's preservative properties could prevent pregnancy decay and ensure healthy births. Women were given carefully measured doses of arsenic compounds throughout their menstrual cycles, with increased dosages during pregnancy to protect the developing child. The arsenic poisoning symptoms were interpreted as signs of reproductive purification and healing. Human remains formed a particularly disturbing category of fertility medicine ingredients. Physicians prescribed powdered bones from unbaptized infants, believing that the spiritual purity of innocent children could transfer fertility to struggling women. Ground placenta from successful births was mixed into fertility potions. Dried blood from women who had died in childbirth was considered especially potent for treating reproductive problems. The black market in human remains for medical purposes was sophisticated and profitable. The exotic animal ingredients required for fertility treatments created international trade networks dedicated to supplying medieval physicians with increasingly rare and expensive biological materials. Rhinoceros horn was ground into powder for treating infertility. Unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, was dissolved in wine for pregnancy complications. Dragon bone, typically fossilized remains of extinct animals, was crushed and consumed to ensure successful conception. The rarer the animal, the more powerful its fertility-enhancing properties were believed to be. The application methods for fertility medicines were as dangerous as the ingredients themselves. Women were required to consume toxic substances on empty stomachs to ensure maximum absorption. They would fast for days before taking fertility treatments, making their bodies even more vulnerable to poisoning. The medicines were often heated to dangerous temperatures before consumption, causing severe burns to the mouth and throat in addition to systemic poisoning. The internal application procedures for fertility medicines involved inserting toxic substances directly into women's reproductive organs, using primitive devices that caused severe trauma and infection. Physicians would use metal tubes to force mercury compounds, lead solutions, and arsenic mixtures into areas where absorption would be immediate and lethal. The resulting chemical burns and tissue damage were interpreted as evidence that the treatments were successfully purging reproductive corruption. The timing protocols for fertility medicine administration were designed to maximize toxic exposure during periods when women's bodies were already under stress. Pregnant women received the most intensive poison treatments during their final weeks of pregnancy, when their bodies needed maximum strength for delivery. New mothers were given toxic substances immediately after childbirth, while they were still bleeding and vulnerable to infection. Young girls beginning menstruation received toxic initiation treatments that were supposed to ensure future fertility. The dosage escalation procedures guaranteed that women who survived initial fertility treatments would face increasingly dangerous subsequent poisoning. Physicians taught that fertility medicine effectiveness was directly proportional to dosage intensity, so women who didn't conceive immediately after treatment would receive doubled or tripled doses in follow-up sessions. The progression continued until women either conceived, died from poisoning, or became too sick to continue treatment. The diagnostic poison testing imposed on women suspected of fertility problems involved administering toxic substances while monitoring their physical responses. Physicians claimed they could determine the specific nature of reproductive problems by observing how women reacted to different poisons. Violent illness indicated one type of fertility corruption. Gradual weakness suggested different reproductive problems. The testing continued until physicians felt confident in their poison-based diagnoses. The survival rates from medieval fertility treatments were so low that most women who received intensive treatment died either from the medicines themselves or from complications caused by systemic poisoning. Medical records from monastery hospitals show that fertility treatment had higher mortality rates than battlefield surgery, plague treatment, or any other medical intervention of the period. Yet physicians continued prescribing these treatments because the occasional successful pregnancy was attributed to the medicine rather than coincidence. The economic structure surrounding fertility medicine created massive profits for physicians, apothecaries, and international traders who supplied exotic ingredients. A single course of fertility treatment could cost more than a peasant family's annual income. Wealthy women would spend fortunes pursuing increasingly exotic and expensive treatments, funding a medical establishment that had every incentive to prescribe the most costly and dangerous interventions available. The psychological manipulation built into fertility medicine created desperate women who would submit to any treatment, no matter how dangerous, in pursuit of pregnancy. Physicians would promise that each new poison was more powerful than the last, that each increased dosage brought women closer to successful conception. Women who expressed doubts about the treatments were told their lack of faith was preventing the medicines from working properly. This systematic poisoning of women in the name of fertility treatment represents one of the darkest chapters in medical history, but it wasn't the end of medieval medicine's assault on women's bodies. The combination of all these treatments created a perfect storm of medical horror that destroyed countless lives, while generating enormous profits for the physicians who administered them. The horror didn't end with individual treatments. Medieval physicians created combination therapy protocols that subjected women to multiple forms of medical torture simultaneously, believing that layered interventions would produce better results than single treatments. Picture a typical week for a medieval woman undergoing comprehensive medical care. Monday brought fumigation sessions to address wandering womb displacement. Tuesday featured scheduled bloodletting to purge corrupt humors. Wednesday involved trepanation hole maintenance and monitoring. Thursday required consumption of mercury-based fertility medicines. Friday brought additional bloodletting based on the week's diagnostic observations. Saturday meant examination and potential additional drilling if evil spirits had returned. Sunday offered religious purification ceremonies to bless the medical interventions. This wasn't theoretical scheduling. Monastery hospital records from across Europe document women receiving this level of intensive medical intervention for months or years at a time. The cumulative effect was catastrophic, but physicians interpreted each woman's declining health as evidence that her conditions were more severe than initially diagnosed and required even more aggressive treatment. The seasonal treatment calendars imposed additional layers of medical intervention based on medieval physicians' understanding of how environmental factors affected female health problems. Spring brought mandatory purging treatments to prevent winter corruption from festering in warming weather. Summer required intensive bloodletting to counteract the dangerous effects of heat on women's already unstable humors. Fall meant preparation bloodletting and womb positioning to ready women's bodies for the challenging winter months. Winter brought emergency interventions to prevent women's corrupt blood from freezing and their wandering wombs from becoming immobilized by cold. These seasonal protocols weren't optional recommendations. They were medical mandates enforced by families who feared the social and legal consequences of allowing women to go untreated. Court records document cases where husbands were prosecuted for failing to ensure their wives received proper medical care, and fathers were charged with neglect for not arranging treatment for their daughters. The legal system reinforced medical authority by making it illegal to refuse physician-prescribed treatments. The geographic variations in treatment intensity reveal how competitive medical markets drove physicians to develop increasingly extreme interventions. Italian physicians became renowned for their elaborate trepanation patterns and sophisticated drilling techniques. French doctors specialized in exotic bloodletting procedures using imported leeches and experimental extraction methods. German physicians developed the most toxic fertility medicine recipes, incorporating rare minerals and dangerous chemical compounds. English doctors perfected combination fumigation treatments that used multiple toxic substances simultaneously. This regional specialization created medical tourism networks where wealthy families would travel across Europe, seeking the most advanced treatments for their women. The journey itself often proved more dangerous than the original conditions, as women weakened by previous medical interventions would be transported hundreds of miles to receive even more aggressive treatments from foreign specialists. The apprenticeship programs that trained new physicians in these procedures created systematic transmission of medical brutality across generations. Young medical students learned their craft by practicing on poor women in monastery hospitals, where mistakes and deaths were considered acceptable parts of medical education. The more extreme procedures a student could successfully perform, the more prestigious their eventual medical practice would become. Master physicians competed to develop innovative treatment combinations that would establish their reputations as cutting-edge medical practitioners. They would experiment with new poison combinations, novel bloodletting techniques, and creative trepanation patterns, always using female patients as test subjects. The women who died during these experimental procedures were considered sacrifices to medical progress rather than victims of systematic torture. The documentation requirements imposed by medical guilds created detailed records of these experimental procedures that survive today as evidence of systematic medical abuse. Physicians were required to record their treatment innovations, patient responses, and outcome statistics. These records read like catalogs of medieval medical sadism, with physicians proudly documenting the increasingly extreme interventions they developed. The international exchange of medical knowledge accelerated the spread of the most dangerous treatments across Europe. Physicians would correspond with colleagues in distant countries, sharing recipes for new poison combinations, techniques for more efficient bloodletting, and innovations in skull drilling procedures. The most effective treatments were those that produced the most dramatic patient responses, regardless of survival rates. The translation of ancient medical texts from Greek and Arabic sources provided additional justification for extreme treatments by giving them classical authority. Medieval physicians would cite ancient authorities to justify procedures that were actually medieval innovations, far more dangerous than anything practiced in earlier periods. The combination of ancient prestige and medieval innovation created medical treatments that were both historically legitimized and practically lethal. The monastic medical schools that trained most medieval physicians created institutional cultures where extreme medical intervention was considered evidence of spiritual dedication and medical sophistication. Monks who developed reputations for successful extreme treatments were elevated within their religious communities and often became medical advisors to royal courts. The most brutal physicians were considered the most holy. The papal endorsements of certain medical treatments gave them religious authority that made questioning them tantamount to heresy. When church officials declared that specific procedures were spiritually beneficial, as well as medically necessary, physicians could justify any level of intervention as serving both bodily and spiritual health. Women who refused treatment weren't just medically non-compliant, they were spiritually rebellious. The economic incentives built into these treatment combinations created medical establishments with powerful interests in maintaining and escalating dangerous procedures. Each individual treatment generated fees, but combination treatments created multiple revenue streams from single patients. The more complex and dangerous the treatment protocol, the more prestigious and profitable the medical practice became. The long-term health consequences for women who survived combination treatments were catastrophic, but interpreted by physicians as evidence of successful intervention. Chronic pain from repeated bloodletting was seen as proof that corrupt humors had been successfully purged. Cognitive impairment from trepanation was considered evidence of successful evil spirit removal. Reproductive damage from toxic fertility treatments was attributed to the severity of the original problems, rather than the treatments themselves. The family dynamics created by these intensive treatment protocols destroyed medieval households while enriching medical practitioners. Families would spend their entire fortunes pursuing increasingly extreme treatments for their women, often selling property and borrowing money to pay for procedures that were more likely to kill than cure. The financial devastation was considered worthwhile if it demonstrated the family's commitment to proper medical care. The social pressure to pursue extreme medical treatments created communities where families competed to demonstrate their dedication through the intensity of medical interventions they provided for their women. Families who settled for less aggressive treatments were considered negligent or insufficiently devoted. The most extreme treatments became status symbols that demonstrated both wealth and moral commitment. The survival statistics from comprehensive medical treatment protocols reveal the true scope of this medical holocaust. Women who received full combination treatments had survival rates lower than those documented for medieval battlefields, plague outbreaks, or famine conditions. Yet these treatments continued for centuries because the occasional survivor was considered proof of medical effectiveness rather than statistical anomaly. The psychological conditioning imposed on surviving women created permanent trauma that affected their ability to function in medieval society. Women who endured years of medical torture often developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. But medieval physicians interpreted their symptoms as evidence of successful treatment that had purged evil influences from their bodies and minds. The intergenerational transmission of medical trauma created families where daughters learned to expect and accept systematic medical abuse as normal parts of female life. Mothers who had survived extreme treatments would prepare their daughters for similar interventions, creating cycles of normalized medical violence that persisted across generations. The religious justifications for these treatment combinations created theological frameworks where medical torture was considered spiritually beneficial for women's souls as well as their bodies. Suffering through extreme medical procedures was presented as a form of penance that could reduce women's spiritual debt and increase their chances of salvation. Death during treatment was often declared evidence of spiritual purification achieved through medical martyrdom. But the true legacy of medieval medical treatment of women extends far beyond the documented deaths and documented suffering. It created medical attitudes and institutional practices that would persist for centuries, influencing how physicians viewed women's bodies, women's pain, and women's autonomy in medical decisions. The assumption that women's suffering was inherently different from and less important than men's suffering became embedded in medical training and practice. The systematic devaluation of women's lives that characterized medieval medical practice established precedents that would influence medical ethics for centuries. The idea that women's bodies were appropriate subjects for experimental procedures, that women's consent was unnecessary for medical intervention, and that women's deaths during treatment were acceptable losses became institutionalized parts of medical culture. These medieval medical practices didn't disappear with the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. They evolved, becoming more sophisticated but retaining their fundamental assumptions about women's bodies and women's autonomy. The echoes of medieval medical misogyny persist in modern healthcare systems that still struggle to take women's pain seriously, still assume women's symptoms are psychological rather than physical, and still treat women's bodies as inherently problematic rather than naturally functional. Understanding this hidden history changes everything about how we view modern medicine and women's healthcare. We've just witnessed a 1,000-year campaign of systematic medical torture disguised as healing, where physicians turned women's bodies into profit centers and testing grounds for increasingly dangerous interventions. Every horrific procedure we've explored was considered cutting-edge medical science by the most educated men of their time. The wandering womb. Theory that blamed every female ailment on organ displacement, requiring invasive correction. The bloodletting protocols that drained women's life force monthly while calling it preventive care. The skull drilling procedures that punished independent thinking by literally boring holes in women's heads. The fertility treatments that poisoned more women than they helped, using ingredients that would qualify as chemical weapons today. Each practice was methodically documented, religiously endorsed, and economically incentivized. But here's the most disturbing revelation of all. These weren't the desperate experiments of ignorant quacks. These were university-taught procedures practiced by the most prestigious physicians in Europe, endorsed by the church, and funded by the wealthiest families. The systematic brutality wasn't accidental. It was the logical result of a medical establishment that viewed women's bodies as inherently defective, women's minds as fundamentally unstable, and women's suffering as divinely ordained. The economic incentives that drove this medical holocaust created powerful interest in maintaining dangerous treatments. Physicians who developed reputations for extreme interventions became wealthy and prestigious. Monasteries that specialized in experimental procedures received generous donations. Medical schools that taught the most aggressive techniques attracted the most students. The entire system was designed to reward brutality while punishing restraint. The religious justifications that sanctified medical torture made questioning these practices tantamount to heresy. When church authorities declared that certain procedures were spiritually beneficial, as well as medically necessary, women had no recourse. Refusing treatment wasn't just medically non-compliant, it was spiritually rebellious. Families were legally obligated to ensure their women received proper medical care, even if that care was more likely to kill than cure. The survival statistics reveal the true scope of this tragedy. Women receiving comprehensive medieval medical treatment had lower survival rates than soldiers on battlefields or plague victims in epidemic zones. Yet these treatments continued for centuries because the medical establishment interpreted deaths as evidence that women's conditions were too severe for earthly intervention, rather than consequences of systematic poisoning and torture. The psychological conditioning imposed on surviving women created permanent trauma that medical historians are only beginning to understand. Women learned to suppress their natural responses to pain and illness because expressing discomfort would trigger medical interventions worse than their original problems. They developed what modern psychology would recognize as severe trauma responses, but medieval physicians interpreted their symptoms as successful treatment outcomes. This history matters because its echoes persist in modern healthcare. The assumption that women's pain is psychological rather than physical, the tendency to dismiss women's symptoms as exaggerated or imagined, the practice of subjecting women to unnecessary procedures while minimizing risks. These aren't new prejudices. They're medieval prejudices that have survived centuries of supposed medical progress. When modern women struggle to have their pain taken seriously by healthcare providers, they're encountering attitudes that trace directly back to medieval assumptions about female suffering. When medical researchers exclude women from clinical trials or assume male bodies represent universal human experience, they're perpetuating medieval beliefs about women's bodies as inherently problematic variations rather than equally valid human forms. The transformation from medieval medical torture to modern evidence-based medicine represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, but it's incomplete. Understanding this history helps us recognize how far we've come, while acknowledging how far we still need to go. Every woman who receives respectful, effective medical care today benefits from centuries of struggle against the attitudes and practices we've explored. The next time you visit a doctor who listens to your concerns, respects your autonomy, and provides evidence-based treatment, remember that these basic dignities were denied to women for over 1,000 years. The privacy of your medical examinations, the safety of your treatments, and your right to informed consent represent revolutionary advances that previous generations of women died fighting for. Medieval medicine's assault on women's bodies reminds us that medical progress isn't inevitable and human dignity isn't guaranteed. The same institutional arrogance that justified drilling holes in women's skulls to cure independent thinking could resurface in new forms if we're not vigilant about protecting patient rights and medical ethics. The physicians who practiced these procedures weren't monsters. They were products of their time, operating within systems that rewarded brutality and punished compassion. Their legacy warns us that good intentions combined with unchecked authority and economic incentives can create systematic cruelty disguised as healing. The real monsters were the institutional structures that made such brutality not just possible but profitable and prestigious. This hidden history of medical misogyny deserves remembrance, not for its shock value, but for its lessons about power, authority, and the vulnerability of those who can't defend themselves. Every woman who died from mercury poisoning while seeking fertility treatment, every girl whose skull was drilled to cure her curiosity, every mother who bled to death from medical intervention deserves to be remembered as more than a historical statistic. Their suffering wasn't meaningless if it teaches us to question medical authority, demand evidence for treatments, and protect the vulnerable from systematic abuse disguised as care. The best memorial we can offer these forgotten victims is ensuring that such systematic medical brutality never returns, no matter how sophisticated its justifications or how prestigious its practitioners. Modern medicine's greatest achievement isn't any particular treatment or technology. It's the revolutionary idea that patients have rights, that suffering should be minimized rather than maximized, and that healing requires consent rather than submission. These principles seem obvious today, but they were purchased with the lives of countless women who endured centuries of systematic medical torture. Understanding this history changes how we see both the past and the present. It makes us grateful for medical advances we take for granted, while remaining vigilant about protecting the vulnerable from institutional abuse. It reminds us that progress isn't automatic, and that human dignity must be actively defended against systems that would sacrifice individuals for institutional interests. The medieval medical establishment that tortured women in the name of healing believed it was practicing sophisticated scientific medicine. Its practitioners were educated, prestigious, and convinced of their moral authority. Their confidence should serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked medical power and the importance of maintaining humility, evidence-based practice, and respect for patient autonomy in modern healthcare. This is the history they don't teach in medical school, but should. Not to shame the profession, but to honor its victims and strengthen its ethics. Because those who don't learn from history aren't just doomed to repeat it, they're doomed to never realize it happened at all.